Today, we're going to look at Carl Andre's work Lever, which was exhibited in the Jewish Museum in New York in 1966 for an exhibition entitled Primary Structures. Carl Andre says that his work doesn't mean a damn thing. While we need to take the artist at his word and realize the lack of their intention and experience of meaning, we also need to realize that doesn't mean there is no meaning present in his work. In fact, when you look at all of the context of the work, it's impossible for it to not have some sort of meaning for you. Lever is a prime example of minimalist art, which is often hallmarked by the artist's conscious lack of intention toward meaning. The irony is that lack of intention is a paradoxically meaningful philosophical statement. In contrast to the emotionality of abstract expressionism and the anti-Zen thoughtlessness of pop art, minimalist artists were deeply thoughtful, introspective, and somewhat philosophically nihilistic. Minimalist sculptors meditatively showed the relationships between three-dimensional objects and our reality, the way that Rothko and Joseph Albers showed us the relationships between colors and our psyche. Unlike other forms of art where physical properties create form that creates subject matter, which then interacts with and creates context, in minimalist art, objective physical properties and form combine with context, which they considered subjective, to reveal subjectivity as subject matter. The subject matter is the subjective understanding of the overlap between form and context, your subjective experience of objective objects. Meaning, if it exists at all, is completely subjective, and minimalist artists were creating objectives. They were creating specific objects. Whether your experience with those objects was meaningful to you or not was none of their concern. Their concern was objective provocation of thought. It's important to think about the relationship between the subjective and objective because it's actually pretty meaningful in relation to your existence. It begs the question if life and the universe have any meaning at all. Most minimalist artists would say no because they were nihilistic, but ultimately that call is up to you. They were merely presenting you with the objective facts to prompt you to explore your relationship to objectivity in your own way. Minimalist artists usually disagreed with the term minimalism because their work was never meant to be minimal. The reason the works appeared so reductionist wasn't because the artists were trying to reduce anything. It was because they were trying to create contrast with the chaos of reality, to bring attention to the presence of objects. Most minimalists, like Andre, argued that their work should be impersonal and removed from the context of the artist. However, to have a full understanding of the work, we arguably need to understand its development, which ultimately stems from the experience of the artist himself. Carl Andre was the kind of person who, whether he found it or not, certainly questioned meaning in his life. He was born to a working class family and struggled to finish his college degree in poetry because of his partying. He eventually moved to New York and became friends with Frank Stella, who is a famous minimalist abstract painter. In a conversation with Stella, while the two shared a studio space in the late 50s, Andre had one of his most famous realizations. Stella, while referring to the back of one of Andre's sculptures, said, "You know, that's sculpture too." From this statement, Andre came to a conclusion. He says, "Up to a certain point, I was cutting into things. Then I realized that the thing I was cutting was the cut. Rather than cut the material, I now use the material as the cut in space." Despite having the realization that would later bring him fame, during the period between 1960 and 1965, Andre created work that didn't gain much traction and ended up working as a conductor for a railroad for a few years. This exposure to raw industrialism and brutalist materialism is often listed as a defining aspect of his personal experience and work. His exhibition of Lever in the Primary Structures exhibit in 1966 catapulted him to fame, as most critics favored his work, but others reviled it. It was provocative and experimental in ways that couldn't be ignored. Over the years, Andre was a major staple in the New York art scene. He was a regular for many years at the famous Max's Kansas City, which was a hangout for artists like Andy Warhol and Robert Smithson. He had many lovers and wives over the years, but never truly experienced romantic stability until his old age. A tragic event in 1985 forever altered the context of Andre's work. His wife at the time, a famous Latina artist named Ana Mendieta, fell to her death from the balcony of their New York apartment. The cause of her death was never able to be determined, and there has been a huge amount of speculation that she was victimized by Andre. Since then, exhibits of his work have often been met with accusatory hostility, especially from women who sympathize with Mendieta. Carl has subsequently taken on a more quiet presence in the art world, rarely making a presence at art shows. Despite the artist's desire to not intertwine his personal context with his work, the circumstances of his life overwhelmingly change the way we view the works when we take them into context. Lever is composed out of 139 ready-made fire bricks that are unjoined but placed together to form one long rectangle. When not being shown, the bricks are taken apart and stored out of formation. Despite the lack of joining, the solidity of the brick material gives the work a seemingly immovable stability and gravity when it is assembled. The bricks are rough and pale and gray, reflecting direct and indirect light from their matte surface. They evoke the qualities of industrialized, blue-collar work, which was something Andre not only had experience with, but something that he valued. In the late 60s, he was a leader in the Art Workers Coalition, which championed underprivileged artists and the accessibility of art for the working class citizen. This salt of the earth mentality can be seen in his dedication to honesty of material throughout his career. He once said, "The periodic table of elements is for me what the color spectrum is for a painter." Line is the almost overwhelming visual property that Andre has formed in this work. As the long, narrow rectangle formed by the bricks extends from the wall and rests horizontally along the floor, it takes on an almost phallic quality. The context of the masculine and amorous nature of the artist heightens the almost sexual insinuation of the piece. The phallic rectangle is supported by and connected to the primary structures of the architectural space, which communicates that the abstract masculine is held in place by the inherent structure of the universe. It suggests intercourse between form and space, and it provokes us to think about our participation in that intercourse. Lever is not as much the object itself as it is the space and experience that it affects. People are invited to step on and around the work, interweaving the pathways of their lives with the piece. So it's not an isolated object. It's an object that is affected by its viewers. But more than that, it is the effect that it causes. Even though it may seem small and underfoot as it's just some bricks on the ground, its effect are really as large as the environment its presence impacts. So it has the ability to be quite monumental. Andre considered himself not a minimalist artist, but a landscape artist and poet. Despite the fact that Andre never intended his work to be spiritual or transcendent or meaningful, it's impossible for me to not see those qualities in it. I think we all have different perspectives of what constitutes spirituality, and to me, honest, objective truths are forms that reveal something that extends beyond our limited perception. I'm reminded of the Hermetic saying, "As above, so below." Authentic presentation of form shows us something about reality that goes beyond this universe. Carl Andre may not have created or experienced his work from that perspective, but that doesn't mean that perspective of his work isn't valid. For me, Lever reveals the divine masculine quality of form and how it relates to the divine feminine quality of space. It is a poem about structure and what that structure affects. To me, there is an incredible amount of meaning in the philosophical context of this piece. Minimalist artists tend to reject subjectivism, and therefore they think that they also must reject meaning. But personally, I think it's obvious that meaning, although experienced subjectively, is in fact an objective presence we find in the infiniteness of reality. The beauty of Carl Andre's Lever is not only that it brought attention to the revolutionary idea of sculpture as objects that have the ability to sculpt place, but that its title acknowledged itself as a cohesive group of objects that provoke and imitate thoughts that we can use as a lever to leverage our minds into deeper, introspective, enlightening mental spaces.